Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another inner hour this week. Appreciate it. I believe all of you know, if you've been here before, that we're doing a series on the women in the original Jesus movement, and this is the third, I think, one we've done in that so far. These are recorded, by the way, just so you know. So generally, the recordings work out okay. So tonight we're going to keep going in that. And to begin with, there's a couple of women that I'm going to mention that were not as prominent as the ones we've already discussed before, but nevertheless significant by their presence and their contributions. One was a woman named Susanna in your English Bibles. Her Hebrew name was Shoshana. And Shoshana typically is translated as rose. Sometimes, like in the Zohar, it's translated as lily. Basically, it's a beautiful flowering something, lily or rose. She's mentioned, Shoshana or Susanna is only mentioned once, which is in the Gospel of Luke. So we don't know much about her, but we do know that she was one of the women from in the Galilean group of women that supported and traveled with and worked with Yeshua and his apostles. So we don't know much about her, but we know she was one of those women. Then also we know from the Gospels and from other non-biblical references, historical, that Simon, who Christians often know as Peter, he was married. He had a wife the whole time. And Simon was his Hebrew name. Peter actually is an English name, so he would have never been called that. But Yeshua called him Cephas, which was a word that meant rock, like in solid foundation. And eventually, as that went from Hebrew to Greek and Latin into English, it became Peter. But Yeshua was fond of calling people by nicknames. So he called Peter the Rock, or Simon he called the Rock, which became Peter. He called James and John the brothers, who were apostles and sons of Zebedee and Salome, if you have been following along. And he called them sons of thunder because they were both very quick-tempered. So there was also two different apostles named James, one of whom was shorter in stature and also had a handicap. He had a severe limp. And Yeshua always called him Little James, and Big James was the other James. Plus he had a brother named James. So he had these little nicknames for people. But anyway, we don't actually know from any source what Peter's wife's name was. There are some legends and speculations and things. For those of you who've watched The Chosen or are watching The Chosen series, which is about the life of Yeshua, rather about his ministry and the apostles and the people he affected. If you've not seen it, it's the most extraordinary Jesus series I have ever seen by far. And from my perspective, at least, while not entirely biblical based and not 100% historical inaccuracy, very close and pays a lot of attention to Jewish customs and traditions at the time. Gives you a real feel of what it was like to be involved in that community at that time and what life was like for people in that community in that region at that time. It's extraordinarily well done. They're going to have 7 seasons. They've had 4. They're in their 4th now, I believe. But anyway, it's remarkable. And in that particular series, which is a TV series, Simon's wife is named Eden, which, again, maybe could be, but he definitely was married. Then in that series also, there's an Ethiopian woman that they call Tamar, and she doesn't appear anywhere in any of the records, so that's just a total invention. But significant also because there were a number of women who didn't make the history books, whose contributions are still important, whether they were financial or personal or food or shelter, support, whatever it was, or supporting their husbands who were involved in the ministry. So there were a number of women who we have no idea who they were. except that it was a fairly sizable group of women that helped. And so this is kind of an example of that in the TV series. They picked a name for somebody that we don't know their name. So the two I want to get into that are well known and were very, very significant that we haven't talked about yet are two sisters, Martha and Mary. I'm using all the English names so as not to confuse you even further. And they had a brother named Lazarus. Again, none of those are Hebrew names. And Lazarus was not a Hebrew name either. If you read about him in Hebrew Aramaic texts, it's Eliezer, actually. Which, interestingly enough, if you think about his resurrection story with Yeshua, Eliezer basically translated something akin to God has helped. So, kind of interesting. But those three were siblings, Lazarus, Martha, and Mary, and they lived in a very small village named Bethany, which was only a couple miles from Jerusalem. So it was an easy walk. And their home was one that often hosted Yeshua and his apostles and various followers. They fed them, they housed them, they provided safe haven for their meeting, especially as things progressed over the years and got more and more dangerous. They continued to provide their home as a meeting place for the Jesus ministry. So let me tell you a little bit about some of them. First, I'll recount a story that you probably know, but in case you haven't read it in a while or haven't heard it, they're all gathered together for a meal, Yeshua and the apostles, in the home of Martha and Mary. And there's a famous story where they're dining there, and Martha is the one doing all the work. She's cooking and cleaning up and tending to everybody's needs and doing all that stuff. And Mary isn't doing any of that. She's not helping with that at all. She's just listening to Yeshua teach. And so I'm paraphrasing all this, of course. And so there's a point where Martha's kind of gotten fed up. And so she gets upset with her sister for not helping to serve this crowd at her house and says to Yeshua, she's not helping me do anything at all. And so tell her to help me. So she's appealing to him because her sister won't help her. And instead of taking her part in the biblical account, he actually chastises Martha and basically says that all of those mundane things like food and all the things and the stuff that she's fretting about so much are worries that she shouldn't have, and that she should, while he's present, listen to the teachings and basically pay attention to God and listen to God and not worry about the worldly stuff. And then Mary, who has been doing that, has taken the better part. So that's kind of the classical story of Martha and Mary. And in most traditional Christian settings, that's the way it's understood, is that Yeshua was saying Mary was doing the best part because she was listening to him and the teachings, and Martha was doing a lesser part because she was engaged and fretting over feeding people and taking care of people and all of that. And that's kind of an example now that's used in much of Christian discussion about we should be more like Mary and less like Martha in our lives. So I'll get back to that in a few minutes, but that's basically the Bible story. So Martha, who's the least focused on in the Bible, is the one I'm going to focus on more tonight. Martha appears 3 times in the Bible. The first time is in Luke 10, and where the story is happening that I told you, where she's hosting Jesus and his disciples. And it's also really clear from the biblical account that this family was not only part of Yeshua's ministry and supported him, but they were very close. He was very close to both sisters and very close to Lazarus, possibly even some distant relation, but a group of people that he really loved and was very, very close to. So I've kind of already told you the story of what happens in that encounter. So Luke 10 again, if you want to read it for yourself. The second time Martha appears is just after her brother Lazarus has died. This appears in the Gospel of John, the 11th chapter. The sisters, Martha and Mary, had sent word, and now mind you, there was no Zoom meetings, no internet, not even a postal system. There was, it was very difficult to get messages, even relatively short distances. But they had sent word to Yeshua that Lazarus was very ill and quite possibly dying. And they believed that if Yeshua came, he could heal him, because up by that point, Yeshua was well known as a healer and had done lots of healings and lots of miraculous kind of healings, as well as probably ones that weren't so miraculous, where more than likely, because the Essenes were very, very skilled, for example, in therapeutic works, particularly with herbal and nutritional things. So quite likely that a number of things that Yeshua fixed that were physical ailments had to do with nutritional and herbal supplements and so on. That would be a reasonable thing to assume. But then, of course, there were these miraculous looking ones as well. So he was well known for that. So they assumed if he would arrive in time, he would save their brother. And even though the apostles did get word while Lazarus was still alive and told Jesus, Jesus didn't go. He didn't take them to go. He kept delaying and delaying. And the apostles were confused as to why he was delaying. And he kept saying it to trust him, and it was for the glory of God. So by the time they left and then traveled to get there, Lazarus was dead and had already been buried in a tomb, which we'll talk more about these later tonight if we get to it, or the next time, about how the tombs were in Jerusalem at the time, which are basically caves or hewn-out sections in rocks and caves where they would lay the body and place a large stone, typically square, by the way, not round usually, but to make it airtight and to block the entrance to the cave, so that, well, we'll get into that later, but that was a typical thing. He'd already been buried like that in a cave tomb that was blocked off. And so then in this John 11, Yeshua and the apostles eventually arrived there. And so I'm going to kind of recap this for you. When Yeshua approached Bethany, which was 4 days, Lazarus has now been dead 4 days. So this is clearly not a case of resuscitation. Some of the stories where Jesus brings people back to life, they've just died. And so from a purely scientific, physical standpoint, there's speculation that possibly he resuscitated some of them, like we might with CPR or something. But clearly after 4 days, that's not the case. He's done. So he arrives there 4 days later. Martha runs out to meet Yeshua and says, quote, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that still, even now, God will give you whatever you ask." So she still believes that Yeshua can somehow save her brother, even though he's been dead and buried for 4 days. And then Yeshua responds to her saying, quote, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even if they die. Do you believe this?" Martha's response is, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the one who has come into the world on behalf of God." And then Yeshua goes to the tomb. One more piece of this, by the way, that's kind of interesting, is even though he's delayed, apparently intentionally, and even though Lazarus is now 4 days dead when he gets there, when they inform him that he's dead, he begins to weep. Not a tear in his eye, but sobbing, weeping, because Lazarus was a very dear friend of his. So the idea that Jesus, or for that matter, any other great spiritual saint, teacher, master, guru, whatever word you want to use, all these ideas we have of these enlightened, perfected beings, that somehow such enlightenment and elevated spiritual status means we don't care anymore, or we don't feel anything for anybody anymore, is absolutely untrue. And indifference and apathy is indifference and apathy, whether it's said to be of a master or anybody else. It's not an act of loving, and it is not a sign of spiritual awakening or elevation. So So Jesus was very upset by that and shared that sorrow with the sisters and the other people who cared about Lazarus, because a number of his apostles were close to him too. And quite probably other people from the family were gathered there as well, or in the village at least. So he was sad with them, so to speak. But then he goes to the tomb, and what he basically does is, at the mouth of the tomb, once it's opened up, he calls forth into the tomb. He does not enter the tomb. He calls forth into the tomb, Lazarus, come forth. That's it. No magical incantations, no get up and be saved, no, just Lazarus, come forth. And to everybody's astonishment, he comes walking out. Now, imagine that that actually happened, that you're somewhere where somebody's in a mausoleum and they've been buried, so they're not burned and they're not buried in the ground, but they're in a mausoleum and they've been there for 4 days. They're not embalmed because they're Jewish, and they pull open the drawer and say, "Get up," and you watch the guy get up. I mean, if that really happened and you could really see that, imagine what that would be like. Now, to put this in a historical context for a moment, this happened right before Palm Sunday, which means this people witnessing somebody they personally knew really well, personally watched die, personally knew were dead for 4 days, and he walks out and is alive again. They watched that. Can you imagine how that spread? You know how rumors spread through small communities anyway. Can you imagine how quickly that spread through the region of, here's a guy who's raising people from the dead? Because his other stories of that, mind you, were far north in Galilee. This is now in southern Israel, in Jerusalem. So that was a big deal, I'm quite sure. So when he goes in, just a day or a few days later, when he goes into Jerusalem, riding on the donkey at Palm Sunday, through the gates, to this triumphant entry, and all these people shouting at him, "Save us, save us." That's largely because of this. They're thinking, there's a guy coming that raised somebody from the dead. What about the people that we care that have died? What about the people we care who are dying? What about the sick among us? What about the suffering among us? And that's one of the signs of the Messiah. What if this really is our Messiah? So everybody in Jerusalem is running out to meet him. Plus, this was the week Passover was going to be celebrated in Jerusalem. So that town swelled to like well over 1 million people, and it was a much, much smaller area than group of people in that. It was an enormous amount of people back then in Jerusalem that week. So big crowds. We don't know how many at this particular Palm Sunday entrance, but big crowds coming to witness what they thought was possibly the Messiah, or possibly somebody they'd heard before and already were interested in, and definitely somebody they thought, oh my God, this guy just raised somebody who'd been dead for 4 days, and all my friends saw it, or I saw it. So that's what probably drew the big crowds. Back to Martha, the third time she appears in the gospel is in the Gospel of John again. It's the next chapter, chapter 12. And Jesus is attending a dinner that's being held in his honor in Bethany, in their home again. This is now after their brother is raised. So the sisters and alive again Lazarus, and probably lots of other people, were in their home. And that's the point at which Mary anoints Jesus' feet with very expensive perfumed oil. And there's a whole other story about that. But that's an interesting one. Now, the other thing that's questionable here in this story, that is unresolved still, so far as I know, from a research standpoint. As you know by now, lots of people named Mary. So Mary, the sister Mary, would have certainly been at that dinner, but we don't know that it was her, because there were lots of other Marys. Mary Magdalene almost certainly would have been at that dinner too, because she traveled with him. Again, she was one of the principal women in the movement, whether or not she was his wife, which she might well have been. really a key figure in the women group. This is a dinner in his honor. So she almost certainly would have been there. And there are stories, other stories, that about the same incident that are not in the Bible, that say that it was Mary Magdalene who anointed his feet. Not the sister Mary, not the mother Mary, not the mother of Mary of Cleopas, not any of the other Marys, but Mary Magdalene. So that's one of the confusing things about the biblical text. There's so many people with the same name that unless you have very clear contextual clues, we can't be sure which one they're talking about. But if Mary Magdalene did do the anointing of his feet, that's an interesting one. And even if she didn't, this is a place where Jesus is anointed. And one of the things that has to happen to a king of Israel before they can assume their kingship and reign is they must be anointed. So actually Yeshua was anointed. So that's kind of an interesting little tidbit as well. Now I want to come back to what I said before about traditional Christianity thinks that Mary, the sister Mary, who listened to Jesus instead of helping serve the people and cooking, that she took the highest part, and Martha, the one who's involved with taking care of their needs and feeding them and cleaning up after them, that was the lesser of the two roles. I want to read you some other things that are much more in line with my personal thinking. I don't know how you look at this or if you've ever thought about it, but Origen was considered the father of the church. He lived in the early first century, or early second century, sorry, in the latter part of the first, the beginning of the second century, and was very crucial in formulating a lot of mystical teachings that were adopted into the early churches. Later, ironically enough, the Catholic Church branded him a heretic and said anybody that listened to him or believed him or followed him was going to hell, and collected all the works of his they could find and burned them. One of the things that Origen talked about was what he called metempsychosis, which is the transformation and changing of the soul from body to body, or what we would call reincarnation. So that was actually a teaching within Christianity for about the first 300 years, reincarnation was. And then after that, after the reign of Constantine, and particularly the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, anything along those lines got systematically taken out and did not end up in the New Testament collection as we have it now. Any references to that were not okay. Any references to Yeshua that didn't fit the framework of the later Christians in the 300 ADs, who were beginning to see him more and more as God and the only begotten Son of God and the only way to heaven and all of those only things. Anything that didn't support that view was pretty much not included in the final canonization of the New Testament. So these are some things that were not included in that. But Origen, speaking of the incident of Martha and Mary, said that it is not true that Mary took the higher of the two, that the story displays that both are essential. And his quote is, "Action and contemplation cannot exist without one another." So he believed that taking spiritual action would lead you into more contemplative life, and that being contemplative on the nature of God would lead you into more compassionate action, that they were inextricably tied together. Teresa of Avila, whom some of you have heard of, she wrote a number of things, but one of her most famous works is called The Interior Castle. It's a phenomenal work. If you're familiar at all with Kabbalistic teachings called Hechalot, the Kabbalistic teachings about the heavenly palaces or heavenly regions, also connected to what's called Merkavah Kabbalah, about the works of the chariot and how to ascend consciously into these higher spiritual realms. Her work, a Christian work, is this interior castle is very reminiscent of Kabbalistic teachings, very reminiscent of something called the Book of Enoch, which describes Enoch's ascent to various realms and so on. So this Teresa of Avila, said that the point of that story was that both Martha and Mary needed to cooperate together to really be of service to God. And in her other writings, she said this was an example of how that rigid hierarchies in spiritual organizations are inappropriate and do not belong. And specifically, she said that contemplative acts are very superior to mundane worldly acts. But if they're isolated from acts of compassion and caring, then they're meaningless. So she too ties those things together as Origen did. And then the last one is a teacher from the 1200s, now called Meister Eckhart, a very famous European mystic of that era. That era, by the way, the 12 and 1300s in Western Europe, Spain in particular, and Italy, but Western Europe in that time, very, very strong Jewish Kabbalistic presence. Many great Kabbalistic teachers from that era, many great Christian mystics from that era who communicated with and shared knowledge with the Kabbalists, many a tremendous amount of writing, mystical writing in Jewish and Christian tradition came out of that particular era. And so that's a very key era in Jewish and Christian mysticism. And Meister Eckhart was part of that. If you've never heard of him either, he's worth looking up. So he says that in his opinion, of the two, that Martha actually shows greater spiritual advancement than Mary does. Because Mary is concerned with herself, being in that presence and hearing the teachings, and that Martha demonstrated she had a deeper wisdom because she understood, quote, that activity, especially compassionate activity, does not hinder the life of prayer and contemplation. That in fact, what one does in the world flows directly from one's contemplative experiences of God. So I thought those are really interesting takes that much more align with how I look at that story. Again, my perspective, I think it is too easy, especially in our age, but I think it's too easy to think that if you acquire spiritual knowledge, or that if you somehow distance yourself from the world and people's sufferings and isolate yourself into a cave or a small community or however you do it, and think that by meditating and praying that now you're all holy, but you've disengaged as much as possible from the world and all its trials and tribulations, and as much as possible from engaging your own responsibilities in the world, that's not really the spiritual path. That's really an escapism, maybe a very pleasant escapism. And sometimes, quite honestly, it appeals to me. But it's not what the great teachers, including Yeshua, demonstrated in how they lived. They were very much engaged with their communities. One of the things, if you begin to study other Jewish mystical teachings like Hasidut, if you study the spiritual teachers, the rabbis or rebbes in that terminology, lived among their community. They weren't isolated up in a cave somewhere or off in a hill or in some rich mansion somewhere. They lived among their communities. They dealt with their community's problems. They counseled people with marriage issues, financial issues, farming issues, you name it. They were integral into the community, and the community life was very much a part of their spiritual service and work, as was their times of isolation for deep meditation and deep prayer and contemplation. It was connected. as we see in the life of Yeshua, going off by himself into the hills to meditate, or taking a few close disciples with him, and also being very, very engaged with his community and very much part of it. So, so anyway, that's the Martha and Mary kind of synopsis here briefly. We have a few moments, so I'm just going to stop here just a quick second, and before I switch on to the next thing, and okay, so I got a couple of questions. The one question was Joanna that we talked about last week. Was she married to Caiaphas or Herod? Neither one. She was not married to either one. She was married to a man named Chuza, and he was the chief steward or chief administrator of Herod's household. So she lived in Herod's massive palace and had pretty much the reign of the palace. Her husband was very wealthy, very influential politically, which enabled her to do a lot of things to kind of surreptitiously support the Jesus movement and the people involved in it. So hopefully that's helpful. Alrighty. So we'll stop here just for a moment before we go on to another part. But anybody have any questions, need clarification, or just questions that you haven't had a chance to ask because I haven't quit talking yet? We'll take a moment in case you do. So hang on a second here. I don't see anybody's hand. Oh, there you go. So Eunice is up there. Go ahead, Eunice. I'm not hearing you, dear. You're muted. Nope.
It's me.
Now you're on. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Little thing I wanted to throw in when you're talking about people rarely mentioned and they don't know exactly what they did
Mhm.
with the women.
Mhm.
When Paul he's writing to the, the central Jews back in Jerusalem. I don't know where he is at the time.
Mhm.
And he's writing to them, excuse me, about taking Timothy
Mhm.
with him
Mhm.
on one of his trips, which the people in Jerusalem are against. They say he's too young.
Right.
But the important thing here is that when he's writing this letter, and I believe this part of it is in the book of Acts, is that he describes Timothy not as the son of, but as son of Eunice, grandson of Lois,
Yes.
not identified by his father, grandfather at all. So
Yeah.
those women were important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's a great example. Yeah, exactly. Very rare.
And of course,
Yeah.
you can see the obvious reason why I'm aware of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good point and a great example because that's very rare in the Bible and it's very rare in literature from that period too. So if somebody was named because of their association with a woman, that woman was very prominent in some way for
And,
sure.
and mother and grandmother,
Yeah, yeah.
so obviously two were.
Hmm.
And when I was in school, we were told just this vague thing about they knew there was a collection of women who supported Jesus' ministry. And, when you see names like that and listed like that, you can kind of put it together that they were probably part of the ones doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Eunice. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great example. Appreciate that. Somebody just texted me or chatted me a question that asked if Jesus actually ever said the only way to heaven is through me. Um, So that's an interesting question. That would be better in another topic more about him and his teachings than the women specifically. The answer is biblically in the Gospel of John, yes. No one comes to the Father except through me. So that's pretty much what you're asking. Yes, that's said in John as having been there. Um, Most biblical scholars do not think that he ever said that because it appears only in that one place, only in John, which is the latest of the Gospels written, like 90 years roughly after the life of Jesus. That probably was, biblical scholars think that's much more representative of what Christians in that age believed than in what Jesus himself taught. So, it's again up for grabs. Did he really say it? And is that why it was written there? Was it added later to kind of bolster their particular view of him at that time? It's Scholars point out the fact, though, that never appears in any of the first three Gospels, which were all written much earlier, which would be unlikely if it were a big thing and important, because you see lots of repetition in the Gospels, lots of it, especially thematic repetition, and you don't see that. So questionable whether that's was legitimately something he said or not. And even if he did, there are a number of Christian mystics who interpret that differently. But we're not going to get into that tonight. But that's a great question. And from a scholarly standpoint, that's doubtful. If you're, of course, a fundamental Christian, it's no doubt at all about it. So once again, as in many things in the Bible, it's kind of up to us where we land on it and how we choose to look at it and work with it. But it's a good question. Thank you. Anybody else before we move on to the next part? So so what we've seen so far with some of these women, and as I said, you could do much longer studies on pretty much any of them, especially Magdalene. I mean, oh my gosh. One of the things to kind of keep an eye on, by the way, so to speak, if you look more into the life of Mary Magdalene, Shirley mentioned last week that, like the Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code book refers to this a lot. There's a fictionalized but historical novel called The Woman with the Alabaster Jar that's about Mary Magdalene. There are a number of writings that have come out about Mary Magdalene now, and obviously you will believe and are free to believe whatever you like, but one thing to just pay attention to when you're looking at books or material or websites, there are websites about her now, is what you're looking at and what they're claiming. There are books about her that are actual hysterical, they might be hysterical, historical research books on things they're finding about her in archaeological finds, in writings, in other things that they put together that are historical research and archaeological research, and how that impacts what we know about Mary Magdalene. That's one category. Then there's another category, which is historical fiction. And there's a great deal of that out about Mary Magdalene, and about the Essene order too, by the way, which was one of the more mystically inclined Jewish orders in the days of Jesus. There were many, many Jewish groups back then, as there are now, as there are Christian groups. The primary ones were the Sadducees, which were the temple priesthood primarily, the Pharisees, which is what the rabbinic Jewish movement that we have today grew out of after the temple was destroyed, and the Essenes. Those were the three primary Jewish groups at the time, and of those three, the Essenes are by far the most mystical, and there's a lot now written about them. Some of it historical research, and a lot of it just pure fiction of what people think and would like to believe. So there's the historical research on Magdalene. There's historical fiction, which uses basic history and then extrapolates to kind of fill in missing parts in a way that would make sense, but we don't really know. And then there's channeled material, so-called, or New Agey material, which comes from people who feel like either they are channeling Mary Magdalene herself, or that they're being given information from some higher source about what actually happened back then, and whatever information they're being given, they believe that's correct, and maybe it is, and maybe it isn't, but they believe that's correct. And so everything they're presenting in their books and on their website is not connected to historical or archaeological research whatsoever, and is not even historical fiction. It's completely divorced from any of that. It's just what they're receiving in their visionary impressions, which is not to discount those, because lots of mystics have visions that are remarkable and helpful and all that. But then there are also a lot of deluded people in the world that come up with things that don't relate to anything, or that are flat out, they just don't fit any of the facts whatsoever, that are really well known. But when you're welcome to read anything you want, obviously, but when you're reading, it's helpful to bear in mind, what am I reading? Is this history and research? Is this fictionalized history where somebody's trying to extrapolate? Or is this channeled stuff that has no connection to any of that, that may still resonate with me, or might not? So Magdalene is, and then there's all these stories you can read. If you start studying like Glastonbury legends of Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea, or those from southern France, Provence region, lots and lots and lots of oral tradition that's not biblical, but lots of oral tradition that actually does fit with the biblical climate that we know of what was happening back then after Yeshua was crucified. And certainly would fit in that scenario. And interestingly enough, again, most of the oral legends, the ones you see in England, the ones you see in Glastonbury, most of those legends are very similar in nature. So there's when we do historical research, that's another factor too, is there some consistency from place to place and story to story that kind of makes a through line of, there seems to be some element of truth in this, or are they all just completely different and hodgepodge and unrelated, which makes it less likely that they were really connected to real events. So back to the women again. The women in the time had much more defined roles than people do now. One of the things that we notice in our culture in particular is pretty much every role is being challenged now, and every role is pretty much seen as not okay. If it's a role, a traditional one, it's not okay if you're in that role. It's not okay for men to be macho and manly and be providers and protectors. That's not okay. It's not okay for women to be homemakers and mothers. And there's a lot of challenging everything now. Back then, that was not so, and a very different climate. And women pretty much ran the household, raised and educated the children, except male children who went into their father's trade typically, and were trained as an apprentice in their father or other relatives' business. Women were the physicians. There weren't doctors as such as we think of them now, but there were people who learned a lot about healing, and most of them were women. And most of the women were the ones that bandaged up, patched up, fed, healed, nursed people who were ill in their family or household. That was very much a woman's role back then. The woman's role was also to provide support for her husband and emotional support, because most men in that culture, being strong was seen as being important, and being uncertain or afraid or sad was often not seen as being strong. And the woman was a place where the man could do that safely. And the man, on the other hand, in that role, was positively seen as the provider, did most of the livelihood that enabled families to survive, whether it was farming or trade or whatever it was. And most of the men also were seen as protectors. It was their job to protect their family. If somebody, God forbid, this didn't happen much back then either, honestly, but if somebody would like break in your house and try to steal you or hurt you, the man was supposed was expected to be the one that confronted them and tried to protect the family from that, not the children or the women. But that was like super rare back then. More of the violence occurred not in homes, but in travel. You know, when you were in unprotected areas out in the wilderness or the road somewhere, and bands of bandits, robbers, you know, whatever would try to loot you, rob you, whatever. Sometimes kidnap you, like you know, like Mexico and some of the places now where kidnapping for ransom is a big thing. That actually was a big thing at various times back then as well on the road. So, so those are kind of the traditional roles back then, and and the women did that same role for the men in the ministry or the work of Yeshua by providing for that community of men, providing clothing, mending clothing, providing food, providing money when they could, providing emotional support, caring for their wives when they had to travel, caring for their children when the men had to travel. Sometimes the older men who were part of this Jesus ministry, who were not themselves able to really travel and do that kind of work, they would stay and take some of their proceeds from their business or their fishing or whatever it was to help feed and provide for the families of the apostles who were off traveling and weren't tending their trades and weren't producing income and food for their families. So these other families would support them. So it's very much a family supportive community, and family was central. There, again, this now is my personal opinion. Had families not been prominent and important and respected, and adherence to family values been such a big deal back then, in my opinion, there would have been no Jesus movement. We'd have never heard of him. That was central. Families have always been central to Judaism, actually, since the very first early stories of creation in the book of Genesis about go out and multiply and raise children, raise families. Families have always been a very important part of Judaism. And rightly or wrongly, you can look around the world today quite easily and see the effect of devaluing families and making them unimportant and not honoring traditional family values. There's a consequence that we see to that pretty readily. But anyway, that family context was a very big part of Yeshua's ministry, and contrary to a kind of an early not early, but early church idea that Yeshua called people away from his families, and they were to be celibate, and they were not to engage in relationships, they were not to marry, they were not to care for their families, they were to leave their businesses, leave their fishing, leave their trades, leave their families, and come follow him. That's a bunch of nonsense. That is not the way it happened at all. And they very much were very involved with their families, and the families formed a very supportive community of the movement, and cared for one another when they were ill, when they were down on their luck economically, when people they loved had to be far away for a long time. And none of these journeys were short. Nobody hopped on a plane for half an hour and flew somewhere and spent the weekend and flew back. You know, I mean, these were long journeys, weeks or months at a time sometimes. Later, some of the apostles were even sent as far away as like India and whatnot. So the women had a lot to do with sustaining the community and the families in the absence of some of the key men as they traveled. And then, of course, as I said before, some of the women took it upon themselves to travel with them to provide that home, kind of a mobile home base, you know, where they went with them and set up camp, so to speak, and nested, if you will, as we tend to call it in our family. They created these little safe havens where they could come back to in a certain region and have food and some kind of shelter and whatnot. The women are the ones that arranged all that and provided all that. So really important work that they did. And again, most of them were not prominent teachers because that was not culturally very accepted. But within the Yeshua movement, many women were studying Torah and even Kabbalah, although I can't prove that last part. and learning to read and write Torah, which was unusual for women at the time. Learning, and actually some of them were teaching other women that, so they were teachers within the Jesus movement. They weren't allowed to do that in synagogues or in public, but Yeshua certainly encouraged that and allowed it, which was again a radical thing in Judaism of his day, and in some more strict forms of Judaism would still be kind of radical today. So that's a key thing, and I want to tell you a little bit next week. I think we'll get to this. I hope we get to it. But I want to tell you something that's kind of unusual and not well known at all about the family of Jesus, and some archaeological discoveries that create some interesting questions around all that. Also, which relate to the burial practices, and also recent discoveries about the Great Pyramid of Egypt and what they found that's also intriguing, that may or may not relate to some of this. But just to kind of wrap up, and we'll draw to a close in a couple minutes here, but I've mentioned a number of times Yeshua's family, and quite a few people think that that's like a New Age thing or a made-up thing or whatever, but that's actually totally biblical. So if you want to read that for yourself, I thought I'd tell you where it is. In Matthew 13, starting with verse 55, Matthew 13:55, it's one of the places that it talks about and names. It talks about his family in multiple places, but here it specifically says, actually it's kind of in a negative connotation, but we get the names here. They're talking about how can this guy from Nazareth, nothing good has ever come from Nazareth. That was one of the early sayings back in that age. Nothing good ever comes from Nazareth. So how can this guy, born in Nazareth, who is a carpenter or a stonemason's son, how can he be teaching? How can he be doing any kind of miraculous stuff? So in Matthew 13:55, it says, "Is this not the carpenter Joseph's son? Is his mother not the one they call Mary?" So now we know their names, but we knew that before. "And his brothers." So here you go, the family. Yeshua's brothers. "And his brother James," who in Hebrew is Yaakov. "Joseph," who in Hebrew is Yosef, so presumably named after the dad. "Simon," and Judas. So Yeshua has 4 brothers named in the Bible: James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Sometimes Judas in the Bible from here on is called Jude, but it's the same person. And typically, again in that era, they would have been named from eldest to youngest. So most likely James was the oldest, Joseph the next oldest, Simon the next, and Judas the next. And then it says, "and his sisters, are they not all here with us?" So we know he had more than one sister because it's plural. We don't know if he had 2 sisters or 3 sisters or 10 sisters, but we know he had more than one, and we have no idea of any of their names. It's not recorded anywhere in the Bible. There are some oral legends that one of his sisters' names was Ruth, which would have been a common name back then. Actually, she's well known in the Jewish Bible as a famous convert to Judaism. They were the first Ruth, so to speak. So a lot of this stuff is biblical, but is not something that typically is taught in a lot of churches or discussed. And as I said, the Catholic Church, I believe I mentioned this before, says that they weren't really brothers and sisters, they were cousins. Even though the words used, are brothers and sisters. So next week we'll tell you a little bit about some of the burial things and what women's role were in burial, because that's why it was the women that were at the tomb on what we call Easter morning. Why were there women there and not men? Because it was the women's role to anoint and prepare the bodies for permanent burial. And if you remember, Jesus was hastily buried temporarily right after the crucifixion because of sundown for Sabbath and also because of Passover. So after that, they were going back to anoint and prepare his body for final burial. That's why they're at the tomb. So we'll talk more about what their role was and what those burial customs were, and then how that relates to an archaeological discovery that's kind of interesting for those of you who might like that. And women are involved in that as well. So, all right. Let's just take a moment here. We're almost at time to wrap up. So, quick announcement for those of you local. Some of you we're going to see at our 1x1 gathering tomorrow in Potluck, which I'm looking forward to that with those of you who are coming. And then also, if you're in the area, I'm going to be the guest speaker at Unity this Sunday at 10:30. You're welcome to join them as well. And the last piece, most of you know this by now, but I still occasionally get questions about it or people that don't know. The Inner Hour series, including this one, is video recorded, and then it's posted on 1x1's YouTube channel, so you can watch any of them from the time we started recording them, or the time we started posting them on YouTube, rather. So if you go to YouTube and you're in YouTube, they have a little search bar once you're in YouTube. And if you type into that, the little @ symbol, and then type @ 1x1, and then the numbers 2734. These are randomly generated numbers. They don't mean anything to me, but so it's YouTube search bar, then it's @ 1x1 spelled out, and then the numerals 2734. That takes you right to our channel, and you can watch these recordings or other earlier ones from the Inner Hour also. And I think that will do it for tonight. So let's just take a brief moment, if you would, and kind of sit with all of that and recognize that all great work requires a community of people to get it done. And that there are the visible ones we see, who are the priests and ministers and leaders and teachers, and there are the ones that we don't see so much, who are men or women who are behind the scenes, providing support, logistics, arrangements, comfort, food, just like in the old days, housing. That all still goes on. In our little tiny 1x1 community here, that still goes on. We have somebody opening up their home to us tomorrow, people bringing food, people nurturing one another. It's still the same. This is still happening. It's the same kind of format. And whether anybody sees your role as important or not, and whether anybody ever remembers your name or not, God knows what you're doing. And those people who are blessed by your efforts also know what you're doing. And that's all that counts. So may we continue to strive to be a blessing to one another, to set aside our egos in that process as much as we can, and be willing to hear and see one another and do our best to be there for one another as we move through this journey together. And thank you for being with me in this part of my journey and for showing up to support this. And for all of those of you who are able and do help us with your financial donations, that's immensely appreciated and is what's enabling us to continue to do things. So thank you very, very much. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and a blessed week, and that I see you, many of you this weekend, and I see the rest of you here next week, I hope. So God bless. I'm going to end the recording and say good night. Good night.